Thank you for inviting me to talk here, and thank you to all of the audience members for allowing us the opportunity to share with you some of the things that are on our minds that I hope will be valuable and informative to you. My name is Mamoon Chowdhury. I'm a solution architect with AWS. I spend a lot of time talking with customers about generative AI, most often in the field of healthcare and life sciences. I'd like to share with you some of the learnings that I think customers find most valuable and interesting when they begin exploring generative AI. So we'll start out with a very quick overview of what generative AI is. What does it mean? We'll talk about its application in life sciences. We'll talk about its application in healthcare specifically, and we'll talk about what are the tools that you have in your toolbox today to use generative AI to really do meaningful and interesting things on behalf of your customers that up until very recently were actually really hard to do. So without any further ado, if I can get my slides to advance, let's talk about generative AI. So as I'm sure you all may have heard or have seen, generative AI has become an incredibly popular buzzword in the last year or so, and especially in the last 6 months. I think it's fair to say that it's taken the world by storm. And we've seen a whole host of consumer-facing applications like ChatGPT, where a lot of the recent advances in AI have been surfaced and made available to the broader public in ways that up until very recently were actually really hard to do. You can now use generative AI for generating images, for generating sound, for generating text. And whilst that may not seem really interesting at first glance, it actually has a lot of applicability to industry use cases, which we see customers kind of implementing now as we speak. Here's an example. This is an example of a chatbot. My colleague Ivo will talk more about Amazon Health Lake in his session, but you can overlay a health lake that stores perhaps clinical trial information with generative AI. And what that means is you can begin to have a conversation with your own data, much like you would have a conversation with an analyst or any other human being who's a domain expert around that data. In this particular example, domain expert is asking natural language questions of a data set around a clinical trial. They may be trying to understand what is the data around that clinical trial telling us, where can we find additional people who may be applicable or valuable to a trial, and so forth. And so this is any kind of use case where you have large amounts of information, and up until very recently you would manually kind of trawl through them. It may be contracts, it may be medical patient notes, it may be doctor's notes, it may be notes of the visit, preoperative notes, whatever the case may be. At scale, you can now have a machine kind of read them and synthesize that information to you. Here are some more examples. My mouse is very gratefully just died, so let me use this. So hopefully you can see my next slide. Here are some other examples of generative AI. You can see that we can use generative AI to generate text. For example, to summarize something. We can use generative AI to synthesize information in something as well. So we can give it a document. It may be a patient's medical record. It may be some visit notes, some practice visit notes. And we can ask it to pick out pieces of information that are important to us and synthesize that as well. So in the middle of this slide, you see somebody asking, what is the patient's primary complaint, for example? And it pulls out the answer from the patient's records. Generative AI can also be multimodal as well. And what that means is not only can we get it to glean insights from images, but also from sounds. It may be a recording of a customer calling a help desk, for example. It may be an image. So we can now begin to, in fact, there are people doing this on AWS today, take an X-ray of a patient and have generative AI generate the beginnings of a analysis or a report as to what that X-ray contains, and vice versa. We actually have customers who are generating test images of X-rays just by giving it a natural language description. If it's not immediately apparent, one of the reasons why generative AI has become so important is that we can now communicate with machine learning models using natural language, just in the same way, excuse me, I may ask you to summarize a patient's medical record or to answer a question about something that's in that patient's medical record. I can talk to a machine learning model in exactly the same way. I don't have to write code. I don't have to program it. And essentially, anybody who can communicate using language in some form can now effectively program these machine learning models to do things that are interesting to them. So where does generative AI fit, excuse me, in the technologies that we use today? You all, I'm sure, have heard of artificial intelligence and machine learning. These are technologies that we've used for decades, including at Amazon too, and deep learning. More recently is where we model neural networks that kind of simulate at a very basic level what happens within the human brain. Out of deep learning, a new field called generative AI has emerged, where we train these neural network-based models on very large sets of data. And the result is we have something called a foundational model. Foundational models are different from traditional machine learning models in that traditional machine learning models are usually very task specific. They take one type of input and they give you one type of output. With the foundational models we use in generative AI, they become much more general. The same model can be used to generate text, like write an email to a prospective participant in a clinical trial, summarizing things like summarizing a medical report, for example, excuse me, generating Q&A pairs on a document, generate some frequently asked questions or build a chatbot. So you can use the same model for many different things, and you can talk to it or instruct it using natural language. In much the same way you may write a set of instructions for a human being, you can do exactly the same with these foundational models too. And so across industries, we're seeing a large range of use cases being brought to production on AWS today. So some of these are things like customer experience. We see customer experience management being transformed by capabilities like chatbots and virtual assistants, intelligent contact centers, content moderation. We see generative AI being used by companies to boost their own employees' productivity by making it easy to have conversational search, to ask questions in much the same way you may ask questions of an analyst or a domain expert, to create content, to summarize text, even to write code that you can execute as well. And finally, business operations also being improved as well. We see companies using generative AI for things like intelligent document processing, predictive maintenance, quality control, data augmentation, and so forth. All right, hopefully I can fix my mouse. If not, let me manually advance. All right, so let's dive a little bit deeper and talk about generative AI within the field of life science. Now, a goal at AWS has been to democratize AI and machine learning to make it cheaper and easier and more accessible for life science customers to really innovate and do cool things with AI. We've done this by launching a platform called Amazon SageMaker, which removes a lot of the heavy lifting, a lot of the really laborious things that are commonly involved with doing machine learning. So it becomes much easier for customers or enterprises to kind of snack on different technologies and experiment with them. I say to customers very often, if you can do 10 experiments in a day, and one of those is successful, it's a really good return on investment. If you can experiment with 10 machine learning models in AWS in a day, and one of them actually works really well for your use case, that's a really good return on investment. And that's why companies like Pfizer, Gilead, Roche, Novartis, Johnson & Johnson, why they're doing, excuse me, machine learning on AWS today. In fact, 9 out of 10 of the top pharmaceutical companies are using AWS for AI and ML. We have about 100,000 enterprises running their AI workloads on AWS today. And what does that look like for life sciences? Well, across the value chain, we see, excuse me, I apologize. I hastily scarfed down a sandwich before this webinar, and I've got a crumb stuck in my throat, so forgive me for coughing. So generative AI can be used for gene identification, for disease research, for example. You can use it for analyzing large-scale genomic data sets, for identifying patterns or correlations between genetic variants and different disease phenotypes. You can use machine learning to identify new protein biomarkers, for example, and these have been promising in things like treating Alzheimer's disease as well. We also see this kind of AI being used in drug design and discovery. Generative AI can be used to kind of design and synthesize new protein sequences, predicting how their structures fold, and so forth. We also see generative AI being used in clinical trials as well. So, for example, to predict the efficacy of new compounds, to understand where there may be possible side effects before entering the clinical trial phase as well. People are also using generative AI to identify the most suitable patient population for specific trials. And once they've, excuse me, identified the optimal population, they can begin to automate and personalize the informed consent process as well using generative AI. And I'll show you an example of what that may look like as well. We also see generative AI used in medical manufacturing by improving efficiency, operating efficiency based on models trained on historical data, things like machine usage, maintenance logs, identifying factors and links between various factors such as temperature, vibration, operating hours as well. As I mentioned, generative AI is a great deal of applicability in running and managing clinical trials. So we see it used in clinical trials and healthcare providers by targeting, who to engage, allowing for really highly focused communications and invitations, automated personalized messaging, creating virtual assistants as well. And also in patient support, we see generative AI being used to analyze patient data, identify patterns related to genetics, lifestyle, I apologize, and environment. So doctors can kind of proactively assess and manage a patient's risk profile as well. So across the value chain, we're seeing a large number of use cases for generative AI.
Hey, Mamoon?
Yes.
It's interesting. I've been texting Vinod, who, like yourself, is eating a sandwich, so he asked me to ask this question. Bayer was one of the few companies who is also an AWS partner. I didn't see Bayer's logo up there. Vinod is part of the Generative AI Council at Bayer, and he was wondering how he can get access to this. And I'm assuming the answer is, well, just email me or you, and we could set you up that way. That's one question. He had a second question about security and retraining and some of the proprietary nature of some of the either data they want to analyze or proprietary patient records. How does AWS deal with the security of these solutions? And at the same time, a related corollary might be, how can an organization like Bayer take advantage of your capabilities, but still make sure that the model is only benefiting Bayer specifically, as they may compete with other manufacturers? How can Bayer make sure that it's leveraging the generative AI model, but as it gets better, it's only getting better for Bayer?
Yeah. These are really valuable questions, and thank you so much for asking them. So let's just take a time out for a second and step back and answer these questions. I would say, first of all, I'd spent a lot of time talking with customers about this kind of technology. Almost exclusively, every customer tells me, I love playing with this publicly available GPT model or this other publicly available GPT model, but I find it really hard to see how I ever use them in production because I can't send my patient data out of my own environment. I don't know where it's going. I don't know how it's going to be used for training somebody else's model. I don't know if that intellectual property is going to benefit somebody I don't want to benefit. It should be mine. And these are really important questions. And what we find is these are very common barriers to adoption for generative AI. I will tell you that companies like Bear and others have access to a secure generative AI platform today within AWS. We have been working with healthcare and life science customers for many years, specifically in the field of machine learning. And to be able to do that, we have a secure platform which supports things like HIPAA compliance, for example, in which you own everything on that platform. So if you train a model or if you tune a model for your use case, you own that model. It's your intellectual property. Nobody else has the benefit of that model. It's not AWS and certainly not any other enterprise. And the same goes for the data as well. If you train the model on your patient data, or if you send your patient data to a model to ask it to summarize a medical report, for example, that data remains your property. You govern what happens to it and who has access to it. We assume by default, nobody should have access to your models or nobody should have access to your data until you give them permission to access it. So we start from a very closed security model where you grant access to your models and your data as needed. And if you wish to keep it private and in-house, our platform entirely supports that. So I hope that addresses the questions that you raised there. And these capabilities are available today.
Great. Yeah, Vinod just commented this was perfect. The other analogy I sometimes like to make is this isn't exactly like open source, but there are some analogies. When people are developing solutions, let's say on top of a Linux platform, there is some public, obviously most of open source is public available, but there's lots of proprietary applications within your environment, within your IT infrastructure, within your applications that are unique to yours. In this case, there are probably some proprietary models that Amazon and others offer, but then again, you just have to set up the right protocols. You have to work with the right companies and partners to make this happen.
Indeed, I would say, contrary to what some of the other options that you have in AWS, we try and make it a very open platform. We support all of the open source frameworks. We give you, rather than one model or two models to use, we give you hundreds of models, some of which are proprietary, but many of which are open source. That means you have full access to the model internals, you have full access to the training data. You can retrain those models on your own data as well. You can bring your own models. You can train your own model from scratch if you wanted to. So we have a very open platform that supports many different technologies. You may prefer TensorFlow or PyTorch or MXNet or scikit-learn, whatever the case may be. We provide a number of models, but you're not locked into what we provide. And so we try to make it a very open platform, and you'll find that it supports the largest kind of machine learning ecosystem out there as well, because we have lots of third parties that also buy and sell models on the SageMaker platform. We have customers who get so good at building models, they actually externalize it, commercialize it on our platform and generate new revenue as well. So you'll find that we have a very open and extensible platform for you to use for generative AI today. Thank you. Thank you for that, Ron. Getting back to this, I showed you already kind of the chatbot on the left-hand side. And when you combine that with Amazon Health Lake, which my colleague Eva will talk about in much greater detail later on, you can really kind of begin to connect the insights that are produced by generative AI all the way back to the source document as well. So you know that your model is not necessarily hallucinating or creating things that aren't necessarily true. You can actually back it up and create an audit trail of information as well. And that's what you see on the right-hand side here. In this example here, a clinical trial, somebody who's running a clinical trial is using a chatbot. And let me actually just start this animation for you, and I'll just forward it a little bit, is using a chatbot running on AWS in a conversational manner. They're asking it questions and allowing the researcher to kind of dig deep into specific areas. In this particular case, they're digging deep on a particular medical condition. They're understanding what is the criteria for participating in a medical trial for that condition. So you can see them typing questions at the bottom. The chatbot is now going away, analyzing all of the documents that we fed into it. It's synthesized an answer, it's summarized that. And we can now go a step further. Because this is a conversational bot, it understands all of the prior things that we've asked it, and it uses that context to address the next question that you pose to it. Which means, just like you and I might have a conversation, I can now have a conversation with a machine. I can explore different ideas. I can experiment with different hypotheses. I can see where they're supported or not supported by the data. And then I can also summarize or synthesize the results of that. So the end step here in this example is it's asking the chatbot to go draft an email to a potential trial participant based on the information that have just surfaced, that it's just found for me. So you can see there's a lot of applicability here. You're not locked down into a single application that does a single thing. You can actually really have a conversation with your data. You can experiment with different ideas, you can validate them, and you can really have a machine do the hard, laborious, heavy lifting of going and analyzing and synthesizing the information that's in your much larger data set in many different ways, whether it's summarizing a medical condition or generating an email with some of that information in it. Today, you can also use machine learning in AWS for things like predicting the molecular properties of a specific compound. So this is used a lot for things like drug discovery. Excuse me. We actually have a solution that you can deploy on AWS today where you can apply different machine learning models to a database of different compounds and understand how those compounds could be used to treat different medical conditions. And in fact, you can even begin to, chain those things together. I apologize for the PowerPoint gymnastics there. So what customers are very often doing is they're taking one machine learning model, for example, to generate an experimental a compound, and then feed it into another machine learning model to identify the target sequence, then feed that into another model to see where the docking sites may be and to see how it may react with different proteins, for example, and so forth. Now we have pipelines of machine learning models that when you put them together, actually do really complex tasks. And so we've seen customers use, use this on AWS to identify potential drugs for diseases that have traditionally been very hard to treat. And this is just the beginning. The promise of generative AI is that it will transform everything from research and discovery to commercialization. We have been doing a phenomenal amount to make generative AI more accessible and cost-effective and secure for customers to use. And so you'll continue to see more stories exactly like this. That being said, let me dive a little bit deeper into the field of healthcare, and let's talk about how generative AI can be used in healthcare. Just like in life sciences, we see healthcare organizations like Philips, Cambria, 3M, and Rush also using generative AI. And one of the things that we're seeing is, just as I mentioned right at the beginning, these foundational models are not tied down to just text. And so they can stretch across different modalities. They can examine medical images as well as medical reports. They can examine audio as well. And they can begin to combine all of these things together to produce insights that are really helpful. So whether you're doing clinical research, whether you're trying to optimize your workflows for handling patient records, patient data, whether you're generating reports at scale, foundational models really have a lot of capabilities that up until recently were very, very hard to do. So we see generative AI being used in a number of different areas. We see it being used to fill in medical data in data science sets, so filling in missing data. We see it being used to create synthetic patient and healthcare data, simulating clinical trials. We see it being used for creating conversational assistants and chatbots, for generating operational efficiencies by things like identifying waste in manual workloads or duplicative processes, using generative AI for reviewing documents at scale, health insurance claims, for example, as well. So we see it being used in a wide variety of use cases. Customers like 3M using services like Amazon Bedrock, which is a new generative AI service that we'll talk about in more detail if I have time. Amazon Comprehend for analyzing medical reports, and Transcribe Medical for transcribing audio into text, to really gain insights from unstructured data that up until recently was really hard to do. And that's currently being used by about 300,000 clinicians to date. In a very similar way, Philips is also using generative AI on AWS to support clinical decision-making as well. And let me pause for a second in the few minutes that I have left to stop and share a demonstration that shows exactly how that could look like. So I'm going to share my my other desktop, and you should see a web browser on the screen. Can you see my web browser okay?
Yes, I can see that fine. And if anyone has any other issues, just use the Q&A so I could follow up with you.
Thank you. All right. So what you see here is a patient discharge summary on the left-hand side. This is fairly standard. On the right-hand side, I can actually create a chatbot to automate and glean insights from all of the patient records I may have. Now, just for the purpose of demonstration, I've pre-populated some of the questions that may be interesting to me. So, for example, I could ask, what is the patient's medical history? Now, at this point, my chatbot will go read the patient's medical history and summarize it, and that's exactly what it's done. What it's done here. Maybe another question I could ask is, what has the patient noticed, or how is the patient's abdominal pain characterized? And here it will go through the patient's medical record. Here is it's pulled out the appropriate document from the patient's medical record, so it knows out of all the information I have for the patient, what is the most relevant information to answer this question. It's taken that input and it's summarized it here for me as well. And what we see enterprises doing is very quickly building clinical workflows where they're automating a lot of the analysis or a lot of the insights they want to gain from patient records exactly like this. In fact, you could have a checklist of 100 questions that you may ask for every single patient within your hospital system, for example, and to have generative AI go through every patient's records, answer those questions, and give a much more concise, summarized report to a provider with links to the original source documentation, should they wish to should they wish to go further into the patient's records. Let me go back to my presentation now. And so you'll see that there's a lot of can you see my slideshow again?
Yeah, yes, we can.
Yeah. Oh, perfect. Thank you very much. So there's a lot of ways in which generative AI can be used in healthcare. And the last few minutes that I have, I want to just very quickly summarize some of the capabilities you have access to in AWS today. Within AWS, we've been spending a significant amount of time in investing in our customers to make it easy for them to use machine learning. We recently announced Amazon Bedrock, which is a service where you can, through the point of an API, consume many different generative AI models from both Amazon and other third-party providers that support a wide range of use cases. In fact, almost all of these models are available in SageMaker today, which is our machine learning platform. So whether you want to do language translation, whether you want to do document summarization in the way that I've showed you here, maybe you want to create a chatbot, maybe you want to do a conversational search, maybe you want to work with images, excuse me, all of these things you can do today within AWS. We also recently announced Amazon Titan, which is our own machine learning model. This can do things like generating text, like creating a letter or an email or a blog post, Q&A, conversational search, information extraction, as well. On top of that, we've invested significantly in hardware that makes it really cost efficient to use machine learning models. Training these models from scratch, if you decide that you ever want to build a machine learning model from scratch, can be an expensive process if you want to generate a large model with billions of parameters. Excuse me. We actually created our own chipsets for training models and hosting machine learning models that dramatically reduce customers' costs when they do machine learning. As I mentioned, you have access to a very broad and open ecosystem within AWS. We have publicly available open source models, and we have proprietary models delivered by a lot of the common model builders out there that are producing very, very advanced models, often for niche tasks as well. We also have a very deep integration with Hugging Face, which hosts tens of thousands of models that you can import directly into your environment as well. So you're certainly not limited to anything that Amazon provides, and we support all of the common open source models and technologies that customers are experimenting with today. So if you think that generative AI may be interesting to you, if you think that it may be something that you would like to explore, I would encourage you to experiment with Amazon SageMaker, because today customers are building solutions exactly like the ones that I've showed you here, using a lot of the models that are publicly available. There are a lot of pre-built solutions. There are, excuse me, end-to-end examples and notebooks as well, so you can try many different models without having to write any new code. You can deploy them in your environment and experiment with them, and I would encourage you to do that, if nothing else, for your own education and experimentation. Once you get your hands on these and you begin to play with them, I hope you will begin to see how generative AI can be used in your day-to-day today. With that being said, thank you very much.